They say that human eye sees more shades of green than any other color, but when we try to paint realistic, natural greens with watercolor, there are all sorts of challenges, like the leaves may look rather flat or somewhat unnatural, especially if you use something like Viridian green straight from the tube, and you may even avoid painting leaves and focus just on flowers, because greens are very tricky after all, but they don't have to be. In this tutorial, I will explain how to paint natural looking fresh greens with watercolors using concepts of value and color temperature. I will show you both a beginner-friendly approach that will give you wonderful results without any complicated glazes, and also more advanced approach with several layers that will allow you to capture beautiful details with ease. We will practice negative painting and glazing techniques and discuss color theory in depth. Either way, you can apply these concepts or even combine them together, like I did in this painting, to enhance your botanical art and to start really enjoying watercolor greens. At the end of this video, I will show you my favorite trick from color theory that will take your greenery to the next level. You can download my reference photo in the video description below. There you will also find a list of materials and pigments, and as always, you can access a real-time, not sped up recording of this tutorial along with black and white outlines on my Patreon. Let's get started on this peony leaf and do a 3-layer painting so we can capture all the details, and then after I will show you a beginner-friendly 1-layer version. And the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of color temperature. Green, as you probably know, is sitting right here in between blue and yellow on the color spectrum. As I mentioned in the beginning, we're lucky to be able to perceive with our eyes all the beautiful variations, from cool bluish greens on this side to warm summer juicy yellow greens on this side. Red, of course, is all the way on the other side, making it complementary to green, but more on that later. So rule number 1 when painting any green leaf is to vary your green temperature as you work across your outline to achieve a more natural look. And to do this, you will need either to mix different amounts of yellow and blue into your base green, or use yellowish and bluish greens straight from the tube. Here I'm using green gold from Daniel Smith for my yellowish green, and you can simply mix some lemon yellow or nickel azo yellow with a little bit of your base green like hooker's green to achieve that shade of green. And I'm using Aqua Green from Winsor & Newton for my cool bluish green. Again, here you can take your base medium green and simply add some blue like Prussian Blue or Endathrone Blue to mute it and bring it closer to that cool sea green, so you don't need that green straight from the tube. Notice that my paint is very light because we're simply laying down an underpainting, which is your lightest layer of color, your first layer of color, covering the entire area of the leaf, and you want to go as light as the color of your leaf veins here, not the leaf itself. We will later add more color around the veins using negative painting technique, but for now, we want to establish this base color, referencing the color of the leaf veins. In the beginner-friendly version of this leaf, we will simply skip this step, but if you want to get more details and achieve better sense of realism, that we need to start with this light layer, and we're working towards something like this. Notice that the leaf sections that are closer to the base, where the leaf is thicker and juicier, are more on the yellowish side. In real life, your warmer yellow greens may be more concentrated on those parts of the leaf that are thicker and have more water, which is why your leaf veins are always a little bit lighter. Of course, the direction of light plays a role, and if you have some medium green directly in the sun, it will also appear warmer and more on the yellow side of the spectrum. On the other hand, your bluish greens will be concentrated in the shadow areas, in this case here and here. But also, if your leaf is quite transparent, you may find the blue-green on the tips, where the leaf is very thin, and you can see it very clearly on this peony leaf here and here on most of the tips. Once this layer is finished and dry, we can finally go in with what is likely closer to the base color of the leaf, so much darker green, and I will be using hooker's green. This brings me to concept number 2, value, or lights and darks in your watercolor. And what you want to create on our leaf is a nice variation in values, or your dark and light greens, taking into account the direction of light, the shadows, and the relative positioning of each leaf section. It doesn't need to be super complicated. Simply look at the leaf in your reference and notice major areas of light and dark. For the darker parts, use more saturated color and less water. For the lighter parts, use more water. What I see in our reference photo is that the top leaf on the left is super light overall, getting the most sunlight. The leaf in the center and at the bottom, those are much darker. We want to make the greens there more saturated. Similarly, the leaf on the right is slightly turned away from sunlight. And finally, the darkest leaf is all the way in the background there. Notice too that within each segment of the leaf, there's some variation in value. So my darks may be concentrated on one side, like here, around the edge, that's facing away from the sun. And you may also add some subtle variations in value around the veins. Those lines have some small grooves, and light would always be concentrated on one side, leaving the other side a bit darker. But this fine detail we can take care of in the third and final layer. I will talk about it in more detail at that stage. Now let me explain the technique and how it helps us achieve realistic level of detail. You see that I'm painting around the veins using negative painting technique. So negative painting is something that I've covered a lot on my channel, and I will leave a few in-depth tutorials in the video description, but essentially we are painting around a thing instead of painting a thing. In this case, it's leaf veins. And because they're much lighter than the surrounding greens, the only way to really get them accurately with watercolors is to paint around them with darker greens. In other mediums, we could always take a lighter pigment, mix some white into it maybe, and paint on top of the dark green. But watercolor requires this special technique to paint small, light details. And notice that I'm slowly working in deeper, more bluish tones into my base Hooker's green, once again relying on this variation in color temperature to achieve realism. The blue pigments I'm adding are Phthalo Turquoise and Prussian Blue from QOR, and I'm also using Aqua Green from Winsor Newton. And no, of course, you don't need these specific blues or as many of them. Just use one that you have on hand, preferably non-granulating blue. But I just wanted to show you how, depending on your blue, the green will come out more vibrant or more muted. I will even add some olive green, which is very warm green, of course, but because I'm adding a quite saturated, darker version of this green, the result will be a deep, warm shadow green. I'm adding these blues and greens into my base Hooker's green wet on wet, meaning I cover the area with my base green or even with my blue green right away and then blend it into other shades of green, creating a seamless transition before the water on paper is dry. Our leaf is already looking quite real and has good texture. If we had additional objects around, you can paint the shadows next, but there's still one more level to this, one more technique and one more layer that you can incorporate to really bring it to the next level. So make sure your underlying layer is completely dry, and let's do the third layer of color. Before I show you my favorite trick, let's first balance out our values, our lights and darks. This step is really necessary because it's very difficult, even with many years of experience, to get the balance of values and temperature right on the first try. So let's use the glazing technique, which is using transparent pigments to create an extra layer of color, adjusting the value and temperature of the layers underneath, and make some adjustments. These adjustments layers on our leaf where we see some major discrepancies between our painting and our reference photo. I'm going to start with this section of the leaf facing us and use my Hooker's green to make it much darker and more saturated overall. I'm still adding additional colors because I don't want the leaf to be flat and just use one green there. So on top I may add a little bit of olive green on the darker areas for warmer shadows, and as I move down I will start mixing in some Prussian blue to cool off my green. There are several sections up on top that definitely require more deep green, more value, especially on this fold right here. And I wanted to show you another one of my favorite pigments, Perylene Green from Daniel Smith. It's a cool, very deep bluish green that is perfect for moody landscapes and for mixing shadow greens in your botanical art. I absolutely love it, often use it for green backgrounds. And again, I'm not saying you have to use it, but I want you to notice and note the variety of different greens that you can add to your palette to achieve different effects. Or again, simply add your main transparent blue to cool off your green, add more value, and adjust the temperature. Here at the bottom, I will use Hooker's Green mixed with Prussian Blue to go over the previous layer almost entirely and make everything a few shades darker. And now my all-time favorite trick, and it's not intuitive at all unless you studied color theory, but it makes a huge difference in how realistic your watercolor greens will look. Before I show it to you, let me know if this video is helpful, and of course there are variations of these techniques for when you want to paint juicy, vibrant tropical greens. So if you want me to do a video on those, leave a comment below. And now back to our peony leaf. Remember in the beginning we talked about how red is on the opposite side of the color spectrum, which makes it complementary to green. So this means that adding red to your green is actually going to work wonders in terms of making your painting look more natural. In fact, if you look at different common greens, like rose leaves for example, they contain a fair amount of red, and at times they're fully red, and so this is why we're going to use it. Again, you're not limited to one red pigment here. Use different shades of red and glaze them on top of your green shadows, or you can mix them into your greens directly as you're painting your second or third layer. I use medium Quinacridone Red here. Those leaves up on top are quite light, so let's use a light warm coral for a different effect. Again, this is just to show you the variations and subtle differences in temperature as you use different reds. And finally, look how moody and dark it looks when I add a cool Bordeaux red. Really like this effect with bluish greens. I like to use all of these different reds in my greens, and you can often choose the same one as the red in your flower. For example, in this painting I used a lot of Quinacridone Red on the tips, so the same red as the one in the middle of the white flower. This helps keep the overall palette cohesive. It's very important to mix your reds into your green shadows if you have red flower in your composition right next to the green leaves. If you don't, your greenery will look like it's completely disconnected or floating in space. So notice in this rose painting, which by the way I did a separate tutorial on, and I will leave the link in the video description below, notice that I have extended my reds into my greens and greens into my reds. It softens the edge between the two distinct color areas and captures those subtle reflections of the rose red in the green shadows. You don't need to overdo it here, just a subtle glaze of red will do. Look how much contrast we are creating in this last step. The leaves are looking more and more defined, and that's exactly the effect we want, unless, and I think this is important to note, unless you don't want so much visual focus on your leaves. After all, sometimes you want the greenery to simply complement your flower or your bird or whatever it is that you're painting, and adding this much detail will most certainly put some focus on your greens, and the eyes of your viewer will be drawn into that green maze. So sometimes, like in this painting, you want to simply suggest some greenery in the background without getting into too much detail, but still keep the overall look of realistic greenery. I went with Aqua Green here because bluish colors appear further away, and so this helps me create a nice background layer of greenery without calling too much attention to it. But let me show you in detail a simple beginner-friendly approach that takes into account the same concepts of value and color temperature, pigment variation, and color mixing, but in a much more straightforward and much quicker way, so you can create realistic, natural looking, but much more simple set of leaves. So this version only took me about 35 minutes instead of almost 3 hours I spent on the previous leaves, if I count the drying time. And there are 3 things you need to know to create a similar version. Number one, we're putting down one layer of paint only. So right away, go with more saturated greens. Your value should be somewhere around the value of mid-tones in your reference photo. And we're going to save time by not painting the detailed leaf veins, but then we will add some interesting texture. Don't worry, I will show you in just a minute. It will not look flat. So the way we're going to achieve a variation in value and color temperature is by dropping additional colors wet on wet, meaning we cover a section of the leaf with our main paint, and I'm using Hooker's green, sometimes mixed with Prussian blue, and then very quickly drop additional colors, your warmer yellowish green, and I'm using green gold, and darker bluish green, the same Prussian blue, in those shadow areas. Our shadows are mostly concentrated around the edges, so you have to do this before your base paint is fully dry. Just like that, you can see it here, the color spreads out, blending directly on paper, and the key here is to use slightly less watery pigment when you're dropping the darker colors, and your paint will spread in the direction where there is a little bit more water. Now you may wonder, if we started with darker values, then how do we achieve lighter tones, more highlighted areas? And the answer is cauliflower effect. This is something that sometimes is considered an accident or a mistake in traditional watercolor, but actually it's a wonderful technique that you can use to add visual interest and texture, and in our case help build us some highlights on our leaves. You do it by dropping some clear water into your wet paint in the area where you want the highlight to go, just like this. The water will push the paint out, creating a lighter highlighted area, and sometimes when the underlying layer is very close to dry, it will create a slight edge, which is why it's called cauliflower, because it resembles the cauliflower head, where your pigment will collect around the water droplet, creating some interesting, unpredictable texture. I hear from some of my followers from Asia that this is actually considered a proper technique. On the other hand, on English-speaking YouTube tutorials, I often hear that this is considered a mistake. Now, I think the answer is somewhere in between. I think if you do this in a controlled manner, just like we're doing here, it can actually serve as a proper technique, because it certainly adds texture to the painting where no other way of adding texture is possible, like the one we have here with only one layer. Lastly, a little trick that will create a sense of some veins present is to paint one half of a leaf at a time. So as you can see, I paint a section, I let it dry a little bit, and then add the section next to it. By doing this, you will always have a slight border right in the middle of each leaf where your values are a little different, and this will create visually a hint of a vein and a hint of a different angle on each side of a leaf, creating more of a sense of realism. And a quick bonus tip, if you stayed all the way till the end of the video, for this type of one-layer technique, try your granulating greens. I wouldn't dare to glaze a 3-layer painting with granulating pigment because it would look muddy, but on a 1-layer saturated version like this, it works like magic, because the paint will separate and granulate in a much more intense and obvious way when you add your little drops of clear water to create cauliflower effect. So as you can see here, I used Cascade green, a bluish green, and warmer green Apatite genuine, and suddenly this entire section of the leaf is showing much more contrast and intensity compared to the rest. Of course, you want to be consistent, and if you do like the granulated look, make sure to apply it to the entire leaf, otherwise it won't look natural. But this was just an exercise to show you all the different possibilities with greens, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you want to learn more about the glazing technique, watch this video next. Thank you, like and subscribe if you like the content, and I'll see you next week.